Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kirby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is our weekend edition, and this is going to be a great opportunity for us over the next couple of hours to cover a lot of issues. Just a minute, we'll also have Michael Berry with us. He is with First Liberty. We'll be talking about something happening in McKinney, which actually looks like it may have been resolved, but that's okay. We'd like to bring that up. And we're going to be talking, obviously, about the bill in Congress. We're going to be talking about the coronavirus, the response, and all the rest. The latest figures, 566,000 individuals have actually contracted the coronavirus. 25,000 have died, but 127,000 have recovered, and we'll get into some of the specifics a little bit later. Penna Dexter with me, of course, as well as Debbie Georgiadis, talk show host as well. And if nothing else, Penna, there's always something to talk about.
Yeah, but my stack is usually divided into topics, and my stack is just one big stack today.
We might mention Venezuela later or something like that, but otherwise it's going to be coronavirus. And I know you've been talking about that this week, Debbie.
I most certainly have. I think there's so many aspects of this coronavirus story that go beyond just how fast it's spreading, what the numbers are, but how it's being used by the government to expand power and in questionable ways.
Well, and again, never let a serious crisis go to waste. We all recognize that phrase,
right?
And all that is the case. This stimulus bill has passed the Senate, $2.2 trillion. I want to go around the table on that before we get into some of the wasteful spending in it, because there is, and that is certainly been taking place. It could be worse, because I've got the list of what almost made its way in because of Nancy Pelosi. But just for a second, to be fair, there was a time around this roundtable where we were critical of spending, what was it, $700 billion on a stimulus package under Barack Obama. And everybody's just going, now, $2.2 trillion, that's $2,200 billion. That's 3 times what actually was passed under Barack Obama. And except for maybe Representative Massey out of Kentucky and a few others, Louis Gohmert the other day was putting a little bit of a rock in the gears. Most everybody's just going along with this. Penna, that's just, it's hard to even get my handle around $2.2 trillion.
It's hard for most people to get their handle around it, although sometimes we just throw around numbers because, you know, when I first heard it talked about, I heard this number, $6 trillion, and $4 trillion of it was not set in stone, and $2 trillion sounded small then compared to that. But, you know, there are parts of this that we have to swallow because so many people have been, by the government, through no fault of their own, put out of work. And so, you know, there's help for companies, there's help for individuals, there's help for airlines, there's help for different parts of government to take care of things. There's help for Boeing, which was already in trouble, which I question. But there's so many other parts of this where the left succeeded. I mean, there are places where there was pushback, but in so many ways they succeeded in getting certain things funded, getting even parts of government funded that is just part of their agenda to solidify control. And so, you know, we can go through some of the specifics, but I think the overall principle is we as conservatives have to watch that this does not become the new normal, and that all these parts and pieces, now it's very complex, are monitored so that this does not become part of baseline budgeting in some cases, and just doesn't grow government to too great of a degree. We know government will grow through a crisis. They always do. They always take the opportunity to grow government when there's a crisis. But we've got to be aware and push back. I think that's probably a real purpose for Point of View going forward in the next many months as we actually get out of the disease part of it and into the economic disease part of it.
Well, I love that expression, the economic disease part of it. I echo all of your sentiments. It's really an interesting thing to look at because $2 trillion, when we hear that kind of number, it is like funny money. No one can really fathom or imagine that. And while it is true that the immediate need of immediate Americans who have lost jobs or their businesses have collapsed and there's some short-term rescue needed, it's also it's the beginning of a shift to the idea that instead of being a free market, produce a good or service, work hard, and then you earn your own way in life, this is a stepping down the path toward, well, government kind of orchestrates everything for us. They decide how much money you need and who gets to be rescued and who isn't rescued and how long it goes on. And because kind of intertangled in all of this is our reliance on experts to tell us how long we have to be in lockdown, how long this quarantine lasts, what should be permitted. And so there's a great deal of power held among a tiny cabal of people in this country that are really dictating whether this spending is necessary, how much more will be necessary, how long will be necessary by their prognostications about the disease. And many people feel helpless. Although I will say there's more and more talk among people saying, you know what? We get to question everything. We do get to question the predictions of some of these experts. We do get to question whether the government is engaging in a necessary response or is a response overstated.
And I think we're going to do some of that questioning today and bring those to listeners. But, speaking of the government just grabbing things, I was on a call yesterday with the Conservative Partnership, and they were talking about a talk of a phase 4. This was phase 3, the one the House is voting. Phase 4, a postal service bailout.
Yes, that was one in the original
enhancing
list.
Food stamps, and the Green New Deal, of course.
I think this has killed the Green New Deal. I think a lot of people say this is what it would be like every day under the Green New Deal, right?
Absolutely. And that I was going to mention, Nancy Pelosi is actually already talking about phase 4, and that's part of what she's saying in her messaging to the Democrat majority in the House is, don't worry if we didn't get all of our things in this bill, because there will be another one. And I really hope, I guess I want this bill to pass and be signed because we have to do something, but I hope there is immediate and loud pushback by the Trump administration and other conservative voices saying, this is enough. We're going to get America back to work. Our plan is back to work, not endless new government payments.
Yeah, and I wonder how this affects the November election in a sense, because I think this is very unstatesmanlike for the Democrats to demand so many things in a bill that's supposed to help people that, they turned it into something so, I don't know, just big, expensive, and really empowering to the government. They tried to empower themselves. And I don't think the mood of the country is there. Maybe to fix something, you need a little bit of it. But I think the country wants to see businessmen survive and businesses grow. And they've already seen how we almost got there and now we've lost ground. But I don't think that's the mood of the country. So perhaps they've overreached. I mean, there's so much going down between now and then. But I wonder if it doesn't affect the elections. Well,
if nothing else, if Facebook means anything and Twitter means anything, the reaction just to $25 million going to the Kennedy Center or $75 million going to the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and people reacting to that. And to be perfectly honest, those are like a rounding error. They're not even significant in $2.2 trillion. Maybe that's the case. But when we come back, we want to talk real quickly about something that's been happening in our area. Last week we had Kelly Shackelford. He was talking about the governor in Kentucky that said, churches need to close down, but nobody else was supposed to close down. And we had something a little bit similar to that. So we'll talk about that with Michael Berry right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
A number of columnists and political thinkers have tried to explain why there is so much hate in the public arena. Shelby Steele is a senior fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution. He has some profound insights on why the left is consumed with hate. He takes us back to the 1960s when this country finally accepted that slavery and segregation were profound moral failings. So the left put itself in charge of righting this wrong, thus giving it enormous political and cultural power. It also led to the greatest array of government-sponsored social programs in history that have cost more than $22 trillion. He believes that this amounted to a formula for power that goes something like this. The greater the menace to the nation's moral legitimacy, the more power redounded to the left. Soon they had compiled a laundry list of menaces. Racism was at the top of the list, but other bigotry ending in ism and phobia were also making the list. This has created a problem for the left. America has made significant progress in racial issues along with progress with many other issues, and this threatens the left, whose existence is threatened by the diminishment of racial oppression. It must find racism anywhere it can in order to make itself relevant. The white-on-black shooting in Ferguson, Missouri got lots of media attention and even a comment from the President of the United States. During that same period, thousands of black-on-black shootings took place in Chicago, hometown of the then president, yet they inspired very little media coverage and no serious presidential commentary. Today, the left is troubled by its possible obsolescence. There is not enough social menace to service its need for power. It's easy to see why the left is consumed with hate. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kirby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Weekend edition in studio with us today, Penna Dexter, Debbie Georgiadis, and we also now bring Michael Berry to the conversation. And, of course, he's with First Liberty. And, Penna, I'll turn it to you in just a minute, but let me just mention that the article they've posted today at firstliberty.org, Cooperation of Church and State, How We Must Stand Together Amidst a National Health Crisis. But it also gives some guidelines in case you are listening and wondering, what can a government do and what can a government actually mandate in terms of church services? And, Penn, as I understand, we've got a case to illustrate that, don't we?
We do. It's the city of McKinney, not far from here. And, all the mayors have been issuing their own sort of orders. On March 25th, the mayor of McKinney ordered all McKinney residents to stay at home except to perform essential activities. And he specifically, in that order, prohibited religious services except by video or teleconference, and also indicating that even if two people gather for religious worship, they are in violation. Wow, that sounds pretty draconian. So First Liberty's on the case.
And Michael Berry, I think you have joined us now, and General Counsel for the First Liberty Institute. And Michael, give us the rest of the story.
Yeah, well, I mean, as you pointed out, the city of McKinney issued that order earlier this week. And when First Liberty Institute, when we saw it, we were a little alarmed by that. It's not something that we normally expect to see here in the great state of Texas, where we love our freedom and our Constitution. And so First Liberty, we sent a letter to the city of McKinney asking them if they would amend their order to number one, to not violate the Constitution as well as federal and state law, but number two, just to kind of apply some common sense principles. Like, look, there are many creative ways that religious congregations around the country have been figuring out to be able to continue to have religious services, whether it is through one church that we're aware of. They divided their entire church up into groups of 10 people, and they do a live stream teleconference type thing within groups of 10. Another church that we've heard of, and a lot of churches actually doing this, they do a sort of a drive-in movie theater style church service where people come to church, but they stay in their cars, and the services are provided to that way. But under McKinney's order that was issued earlier this week, you wouldn't even be allowed to do those things. So we asked the city to amend its order, and I'm very pleased to announce that, just a couple of hours ago, and within hours of receiving our letter, the city of McKinney decided to amend its order and is now going to allow people to actually conduct religious services as long as they comply with the CDC's 15-day guidelines, and that's what we think is perfectly fine.
Well, Michael, it's good to pick out a city like McKinney and do this, and I wonder how many other cities there are across Texas and across the nation that are violating it, and not necessarily out of a desire to inhibit someone's constitutional rights, but out of an abundance of fear right now. There's an atmosphere of fear that's been created. What do you think about that idea?
I think that's spot on. I don't think that there are a lot of city councils and mayors and even governors who are going around thinking, now how can I use this coronavirus pandemic to take away people's constitutional rights? Or at least I certainly hope that that's not the case. I think this, as you said, Bennett, there's a lot of fear, a lot of uncertainty and anxiety, and obviously rightfully so in many instances. But again, that's when we need to have clarity more than ever, right? That our Constitution was designed, it was written at a time of crisis, a time of revolution, and a time of war. And so it was designed for an American people who understand that, yes, there is a need for the government to look out for public health and welfare, but it must do so in a way that balances that with constitutional rights and freedoms, especially those that are enshrined in our First Amendment. And that's what we're asking for, and the guidance that we're providing at First Liberty. And folks can go to firstliberty.org if they want to see what the guidance is. Give it to your religious leaders, your government officials, et cetera, so that they can see there's a way to do this. There's a way to balance public health without violating the Constitution, and that's what we should be trying to do. The faith community and the government, at a time like this is when we need to be working together, not against each other.
I'm so grateful for all that First Liberty does and for what you just described. I'm just curious. It is if a local government, a mayor or a county, put in place a rule that said there's absolutely no exceptions, no one gets together. So it was not specifically targeting religious institutions and churches, but just no more than 3 people together, whatever kind of really harsh ruling, but it was applicable to everyone. I still wish there were, and I want to ask you, I don't know how any First Liberty anyone would proceed to challenge this, but there's something really wrong with the idea that a church that is obviously voluntary and the pastors want to hold the service and the church attendees want to attend and they're fully aware of the spread of this virus, but they prefer to attend. Is there any basis for a constitutional argument that the government just does not have the right to shut down churches even when the rule applies to everyone equally?
Well, that's a great question, and that one and many other similar questions are actually answered in the guidance that we provide. So again, go to firstliberty.org to find it. But to answer your question, in a situation like that, where if the government if the situation got so bad, right, where the government is essentially saying no public gatherings of any kind, no exceptions whatsoever, even so-called essential businesses, et cetera, you're not exempt, you must comply as well, then at least in that instance, the government would be applying it evenly, right? There would be an even-handed application, which is good. Now, we would say that type of order might be permissible under the Constitution, assuming that it was for a temporary duration, right? It could not be a permanent or one that was indefinite. It would have to be temporary in nature, only so long as absolutely necessary to address, whatever the situation was. So And again, I shudder to think of a situation that would require something like that. But I mean, really, it would be a situation where what we would think of as martial law being declared, where you literally have the National Guard coming in and shutting down everything to ensure that there is nobody on the streets, there's nobody, gathering anywhere. So I hope that this country never sees that day.
I hope so as well. One last little iteration on that. So suppose that, and thank you for that answer. It's very, very logical. So suppose that were to be the case. So what I'm getting at, though, the government's authority to issue these kind of things, leaving aside whether it's churches or, people who want to practice cheerleading in the park together, whatever the reason they want to be out and about. Is there, and this is beyond a religious liberty legal question, but is there a basis for citizens to challenge an order based on the fact that, or on the argument that the data supporting what the government is requiring simply is insufficient to meet a standard of an emergency order of that kind? Is there still a way to challenge it, or does the government have pretty much in emergency situations absolute authority that you cannot challenge?
Well, the answer is sort of yes and no. That government officials, whether it's the president or the governor of a state, certainly has broad authority to issue a declared state of emergency. And that, and I would hope that most people are sort of loath to question whether or not it truly is an emergency. We would like to assume, regardless of where we fall on the political spectrum, that if a president or governor truly does issue a state of emergency, let's use a different example. If a hurricane, or a tornado passes through and there's just widespread devastation, and in order to prevent looting or the spread of infection or illness or whatever, those types of orders need to be issued. Again, I don't think many people would sit there and think, well, I really doubt that this is truly an emergency, and I think we should challenge that. I think people would need to be banding together to help each other during those times. But again, as is the case with natural disasters, we know that those are very temporary, right? Once we've sort of gotten past the worst of it and the cleanup has started again, then the declaration should be lifted. And that's the way it's supposed to work. So in a situation like this pandemic, if somebody wants to question the data and say whether or not, I really don't think this is truly a pandemic, or I don't think that it's as bad as some people say it is. And we've all seen social media and other places saying, some of these so-called experts are now walking back their predictions of how many thousands or tens of thousands of people are going to get infected and die. I don't know that when you're in the midst of the crisis is necessarily the appropriate time to raise those challenges. It's not to say that those challenges couldn't be raised. I just don't know that that's the wisest time to do it. And then if people ask, well, then how do we make sure that the government is held accountable? That's through the political process. If you have a president or a governor that abuses their discretion and wants to declare everything an emergency just so that they can have more power, then vote them out of office because obviously they're abusing their discretion. And
Michael Berry's been with us. We're going to take a break, and we'll come back with more right after this.
2020. Is there anything important happening this year? Well, not unless you consider major disputes in various Christian denominations, international tensions over a flu epidemic, economic uncertainties, and a presidential election important. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kirby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It's easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kirby Anderson.
Privileged to have in studio with us today, Penna Dexter, Debbie Georgiadis, and we are going to be covering quite a bit. So if you find yourself saying, you didn't talk about this, you didn't talk about that, we're just trying to pace ourselves out here. We're going to talk about whether or not some of the models that have been used can be justified. We're going to be talking about the bill that went through the Senate and is now in front of the House. And right at the moment, Representative Thomas Massey at least wants an up or down vote with a recorded vote, so we'll talk about that. We're going to wonder whether or not maybe there's been some overreaction. We're going to talk about what's the exit strategy. When could we get back to normal? And those are just a few of those. I do have a whole section on questions and answers on the checks, because some of you say, when am I going to get my $1,200 check? And is it tax-free? And all sorts of other things. So I'll answer those questions in due course. But since we've been talking about government authority, I guess, if nothing else, Debbie, you started it. We now have the governor of the state of Texas issuing a order, which I don't disagree with, but it says now if you're flying in from New York, New Jersey, or Connecticut, and having lived in some of those places, I can relate to this only so well, then you have to go through a mandatory 14-day quarantine. So.
And New Orleans.
Okay, so
Thank goodness in New Orleans.
Yeah, I forgot to mention New Orleans. Sorry, I was just reading very fast. But New Orleans because of Mardi Gras, and so does the governor have the right? I think he does. What's your thoughts?
I think he does in that case. And I think the factors to assess these things by, the reason he didn't pick random states that have no bearing on the question. He's looking at states where there's been an active, serious problem with coronavirus, and it spread before people were really aware of it. There were carriers that were walking around and spreading it. And so this is a limited in time, which is a big, big factor. Limited in time. It is people who are quarantining, meaning you're not being arrested. You're just saying, do the things that we did with previous viruses, previous things we were worried about.
Right.
You quarantine so you don't infect other people. And it's a limited time with a specific logical connection to the identified group. And it is a quarantine, not a, you can't come here and you never come in Texas again. So to me, that's logical, and it's tied to the idea of emergency powers to protect the people of your state. The concern with some of the other orders is they appear to be, they'll be given a date.
Indefinite
in length.
Yes.
Unjustified by the numbers that you are seeing in the various places. And there is a growing concern about the data on which people have relied. I know we're going to get to that later, but a growing concern about whether sometimes there is a motive for the creation of data, creation of the models. And here we're right for our listeners. We are in Dallas County, and we are under a shelter-in-place order, which has as the basis of it some data that is now being very seriously questioned as to its accuracy, the source of it being politically biased. And then, so the idea that we're jumping into place, shutting down businesses and shutting down really the economy based on data that may be flawed or even politically manipulated.
You know, in looking at this, and I've been thinking about this all week, because that last week was the last week. This 15 days is over on Monday. So, you know, we haven't really heard any plans. We don't have any plans of what's going to happen. By all the news and the discussion that's out there, it probably won't end at 15 days.
No,
but I think President Trump does not, his quote is, we cannot let the cure be worse than the problem itself. I think he would like to see it open up, or perhaps it's a medical community versus the economy battle that's still taking place in Washington, D.C., but we need to be having it here. And I think this on the part of Governor Abbott was good. It actually takes place tomorrow at noon. And so, it sends the message that governors are in charge of their own state, that this is not a national top-down thing. It's to protect our state. And I think the missing piece is we have to talk about how temporary these things have to be. That has to be reiterated, I think, in all the announcements. And so, I hope that we can, we have adjusted our language during this. So I hope we can adjust our language with regard to that. So who was it that said this? It had to do with being a sending state. New York is a sending state. Fauci says that. And we would be the recipient of people from the sending state. And,
Yes.
you just have to, sorry, we're offending a few people, but we have to put our protections up.
I don't even think, I think that if you were we were talking on the break a little bit about most people, even if the rules were not in place, people, the vast majority of Americans, they want to be responsible. They don't want to be infected. They don't want to infect others. They will engage in the responsible behaviors we've been talking about, even if the government didn't mandate it. And I think, it's a little bit related to what you were just talking about with Governor Abbott. But I saw one, I think it was an epidemiologist, was arguing all these universities that had kids living in close quarters,
Yes.
of course,
Mm-hmm.
and then they're closed down. The kids all go home.
So their
now,
elderly
all these
parents and
people
grandparents.
spreading it to whatever their hometown is. I mean, the whole notion of these shutdowns and expulsions, I think, is another whole factor. Do we make the wisest decision? I'm not saying they did or did not have to shut down the universities. When you send them all home and they're all going to around the country and bringing whatever they brought from their college, you are kind of spreading it too. There aren't easy, simple, black and white rules or answers. But the other aspect, you mentioned the time limit on all these, and I completely agree. I like that what Governor Abbott said, the 14-day thing, that is a period, that is the ending of the period during which if you have come in contact with a virus, you will either manifest symptoms or you'll just kind of rock through it and you won't have a problem.
What do we do about people that disobey? And there are two ways to look at this. Let's go to the state of California for a minute. The police department there in Chula Vista, for example, have these drones that now have night vision and that are actually made in China, that now they can fly over a group and they can actually speak and say you need to disperse because they don't want to have police doing that. Or you have the mayor of Los Angeles, we were talking about this earlier in the week with Andrew, Eric Garcetti, who announces that if you are a non-essential business and you're not closed, we'll just shut down the water and power to your particular complex. What about that?
This bill in Texas, Governor Abbott said it will be enforced, potentially up to 180 days in jail, but also saying this is simply to achieve the goals of reducing the spread that federal officials have set. And so, I hope citizens can be wise. I hate hearing these enforcements, though.
Yeah,
I
I do
hate
too.
hearing that.
I especially dislike the drones because that is just I really.
China made. So they've been using these in China, so now we're using them in California.
Yeah, I
police
think
departments.
that it's very, very alarming. And, it is an interesting thing. I think on the one hand, when everyone was first aware of it and everyone was being warned, don't be in crowds and kids are showing up on beaches on spring break. So many people were saying, for crying out loud. I mean, did you not read the paper? Do you not know what's going on? And some of them have said, hey, if I get the virus, I get the virus. They were cavalier about it, and that's frustrating to people. But even being discussed with other people's decisions, you have to balance that against how much authority are we saying the government can have to enforce these. To me, shutting down water and power is too much. It's a bridge too far to businesses that are not supposed to be open. I mean, you can fine them and say, but the idea of forcing them to close because it's, in California getting too hot in your building and you can't, there's no running water. That's becoming draconian. And I wish I had a more articulate black line or, clear line formula, but that's too much in my view.
I think you mentioned this, Debbie, but I want to reiterate. I hope that as this ends, we begin to have a lot of legislators that are concerned about freedom to introduce bills to stop the government from having these kinds of, some of this is necessary, but to have the power that this signals, we've got to, I guess, we can't assume that everyone understands and knows the Constitution anymore. And so we have to enshrine constitutional rights in many laws. We're going to have to be working on that, I think.
Yeah, what I was saying, I'm so glad, Penna, that you remind me, but I think that point is so important for state level, for county, for city, all the legal entities that have authority to declare states of emergency. There has to be, if there are not, clear standards that are met. Like, when can you do this? And what is a citizen's right to challenge these? What is the citizen's right to assess the evidence underlying it, to bring a court challenge, so you're not just left with helpless citizens who wait out some order that may be in place too long?
Well, we're going to take a break, and when we come back from the break, I would encourage those of you, especially online, or if you're not online, to go online and hear Penna Dexter's commentary on China and medicines. And that brings up the other issue, because they're talking about a class action suit against what China has done. You've had Senator Tom Cotton and a number of others asking for action, and you've heard the Secretary of State talking about this. But there's another issue, and that's just the if you will, the supply chain. So I thought we might talk about that for just a minute. And we'll probably come back to that again in the National Hour. But since you have a chance to hear Penna Dexter, let's hear from her and then get her comments right after these important messages.
As we all adapt to social distancing, the new normal for daily living, we've also got to get serious about economic distancing from China. We have become too dependent on China in key sectors of our economy, like pharmaceutical and medical supply production. China's state news agency has issued several warnings that if the United States isn't careful, China could ban exports of pharmaceuticals and medical protective gear and throw our nation into, quote, a mighty sea of coronavirus. And they could do it. We depend on China for 80% of the core components we use to make our generic drugs. Generic drugs comprise 90% of the medicines Americans take. China also supplies more than 90% of the antibiotics we take, plus many other drugs and biologics that we depend upon. According to Rosemary Gibson, author of China RX, Exposing the Risks of America's Dependence on China for Medicine, China has pursued a deliberate strategy to disrupt, dominate, and displace advanced industries in the U.S. and other Western countries. One tool China uses for this purpose, she writes, are cartels, which work to undercut the prices other countries charge for things. China can do this because of its lower labor costs, weaker environmental regulations, and worker protections. An example of how this works is penicillin. The U.S. once produced 70% of the world's supply. Rosemary Gibson writes that in 2004, the Chinese cartel dumped the chemical material to make penicillin on the global market at below market prices, kept them low for 4 years, and drove out U.S. production. In fact, we are in the dangerous situation where production of practically all antibiotics and many other vital medicines has disappeared from the U.S. U.S. Senator Tom Cotton says it's time to pull America's supply chains for life-saving medicine out of China. He and Representative Mike Gallagher have introduced legislation to do so. This needs to be executed rapidly. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again in studio with us today, Penna Dexter, Debbie Georgiadis. And let me just mention a couple of commentaries that we've actually quoted from. Penna Dexter's one last week, Coronavirus and Government. I think I quoted rather extensively from it yesterday because we were talking about Italy, and it came up in terms of what we've now learned about Italy and the fact that there was a kind of a long-term failure to invest. So that's last week. And if you aren't already receiving Penna Dexter's commentaries, of course, we make those available from me Monday through Friday in your inbox. Hers will arrive in your inbox tomorrow if you sign up. And this one on China and medicines. And boy, Penna, I've learned lots of things. It used to be that the United States produced 70% of the world supply on things like penicillin. Now we're dependent on China for 80% of the core components for generic drugs. We have got to turn that around, don't we?
Yeah, and I didn't know this until I read it last week to write this. Generic drugs comprise 90% of the medicines Americans take now. Also, China supplies more than 90% of the antibiotics we take, plus many other drugs and biologics, but we're thinking antibiotics here. And there was a story about penicillin. The U.S. produced 70%, as you said once. But this Rosemary Gibson, who wrote a book about this, the book's China RX, exposing the risks of America's dependence on China for medicine. But some of this is actually malevolent. The Chinese cartel dumped the chemical material to make penicillin on the global market at below market prices, and they left it there for 4 years, which then U.S. companies shut down their production. They couldn't compete with those prices. And then after that, of course, China can charge more because they've destroyed our manufacturing of penicillin. So we are in a very dangerous situation with regard to our medicines. I saw this percolating early in the year. In January, people started writing articles about it, and I thought, it was bad, but now we are all experiencing how bad it is. And there's actually some legislation being proposed to Marsha Blackburn is doing one bill, and then Senator Tom Cotton's doing another bill. Mike Gallagher doing the kind of companion bill for Cotton's bill in the House to pull America's supply chains for life-saving medicine out of China. A country that has not shown us that they are a really cooperative world citizen in a sense, who cares about their customers, which is us and other countries. They do not need to be trusted with things like that. I mean, we ought to look at all of our manufacturing, but I think medicines is a big one. And so this is a big issue, and we're really depending on our adversary for something very important.
I'm so glad this topic is coming up. Rosemary Gibson's book, even before we knew about the coronavirus problem, she was making these points about, in addition to the fact they are not our friend, they're very much our enemy, they just don't have the Western standards we have for inspections, for cleanliness. When there was a problem with some particular thing, it was an insulin or some drug, and we, the FDA, said we want to bring our people over there to inspect the plant, they said, no, can't do that. And this is maybe a tiny little silver lining out of this coronavirus problem, is that America, you mentioned 2 bills there. President Trump has made references to it. It's a great opportunity to say, you know what, we should bring this back here, not just because we think we'll do higher quality production, which I think we will, but we're bringing back something that you really should. It's a vital need for Americans, and we shouldn't be depending on anybody. We are America. We can produce our own. It'll create jobs, create factories. It may raise prices, but ultimately to be in charge of the quality ourselves, and not to be at risk of whatever China wants to do with us if they don't like any actions we take in terms of holding medicines back. I mean, it could be very dangerous.
This president said he was going to bring manufacturing back to the U.S., and some of that had already started. This coronavirus situation, I think, is going to expedite that. I taught for years ESL, and I had a lot of Chinese students, and I became friends with a couple of them. One actually was a lawyer, and she got an American law degree at SMU while she was here, and another one was... She was just a professor in China, but she was here with her husband working in the tech field. And so I'm helping them with their English. And they told me that, they started a business together, sending products back just started with their friends in China because their friends were having babies and they didn't want the baby food. And they didn't want the formula.
Whoa.
And so, and she said, you have to come to China. It's a beautiful country. She said, but I'm going to have to help you with what you eat and what you don't eat while you're there. So they don't trust their government. They don't trust their system to have food that's safe. I mean, we already suspect that perhaps it was actually food that started this whole coronavirus thing. But to me, to think that you're a Chinese citizen that's well educated, that has some means, that can't even get the kind of food that you would want to or even think was safe to eat.
Tying back to our coronavirus topic just a bit, so many people have been commenting on comparing America's numbers and exposures and deaths and all the statistics to China. But on my own show, I had an expert on who was talking about his book about China, Brigadier General Spalding. You probably had him anyway. He was talking about, just talking generally speaking, about China and their secretiveness and how much they have manipulated the world and America and the markets. But there's absolutely no reason to trust anything they say about what's happening with their coronavirus in China, to trust their data, their death rate, it's all gone. It's a 24/7, propaganda machine that is the government. So we have no idea what's really happening inside that country and should not take any clues for our behavior.
I mean, we shouldn't model our response after theirs.
Yeah, right. That'd be one thing. Yeah.
Our first article here, U.S. leads world in coronavirus cases. And I had people saying, yeah, well, that's assuming that the China numbers are right. And we know they're not. And so that is certainly the case. But haven't we benefited by having energy independence, where we were no longer dependent on Saudi Arabia or Iran or Iraq or whatever it might be? Isn't this the same kind of argument? We're no longer dependent upon China to produce pharmaceuticals or even the component parts for some of those pharmaceuticals?
Yes, it does. It's sadly the energy situation may see a setback because oil prices are so low.
That's true.
But that's just another whole part of this.
Great model, though. Yeah.
Yes, but it is a great model. And I think that's been one of the disruptions of this president as he's come into office. Little did he know that he would be hit with this crisis, this pandemic that will actually probably advance that part of his agenda.
Well, if nothing else, let's give credit where credit is due. Bayer actually donates 3 million chloroquine tablets, not to be confused with the other one that you talked about on your show this week, which was chloroquine phosphate, which actually is very useful if you're trying to clean aquariums. But
fish,
I don't know.
Your fish tank at home.
Yeah. First of all, never self-medicate. Second of all, never put something in your mouth that says not fit for human consumption, right?
Absolutely. I am very sorry for this gentleman in Arizona who lost his life because he and his wife heard something about this chloroquine, maybe a good thing, maybe helpful, so anti-malarial drug, and maybe it could help with coronavirus. And the wife thought, oh, hey, that sounds just like what's in our fish tank cleaner product. So they actually consumed fish tank cleaner dissolved in water. And very sadly, the husband passed on. The wife had very serious injuries also, very serious illness. It is obviously don't self-medicate but I think the political angle in that story is just how silly it was that so many people immediately pointed to, the leftist media pointed to President Trump. See, now people are dying because he said something stupid. What he said is great. This idea of chloroquine actually may be remedial with respect to treating coronavirus.
Yeah. Well, we got to take a break, and when we come back, we'll have the National Hour, and we'll be getting into all sorts of issues here, and certainly want to talk about this bill that's making its way through Congress. We want to talk about the model that has been used by a lot of governors and mayors and others, even county judges, to determine what they're going to do next. A lot of big questions that we'll talk about right after these important messages.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @Point of View RTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kirby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kirby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is our weekend edition. Penna Dexter and Debbie Georgiadis in studio. Debbie Georgiadis, of course, a talk show host. Penna Dexter has been a co-host for all these years, and we have information about both of them on the website in case you want to connect up with them. We also have Penna Dexter's Viewpoints commentary, which we'll talk about later. We have posted lots of articles, and some of those have to do with the number of individuals, both in this country and worldwide, that have contracted the coronavirus, 566,000 in round numbers, and the number that have recovered, 127,000. And, of course, the real question is whether or not the United States has exceeded the number of cases in China, since we don't really trust China. So we'll leave that there. But before we get into some of the other issues, because we're going to talk about the ongoing question that has come, which we mentioned briefly earlier in the week, about whether some of these models, which are used to close down various cities, counties, or even states, is appropriate, and whether or not maybe some of those numbers need to be reevaluated. We'll also try to, a little bit later, answer your questions about these checks, because now those checks will be going out. But is that $1,200? Is it tax-free or not? And how that will affect you, and how they will determine who receives those. I'll talk more about that a little bit later, but we have an article on that. But let me just talk about what has just happened within the last hour or so. The House of Representatives did pass the $2.2 trillion stimulus. There was a big question mark because Representative Thomas Massey, 4th District in Kentucky, who has oftentimes voted against various procedures, against various stimulus bills, various kinds of even disaster bills, oftentimes been known as Dr. No, was raising the question of whether or not there could be a full roll call vote. That caused a number of members of Congress to say, wait a minute. If that's going to happen, we're going to have to get on an airplane, which, given the fact that we have a public health emergency, a lot of them did not want to do. Well, anyway, the bottom line is...
Well, some of them test positive for coronavirus.
That's right. Yeah, there's some
so they
of them
don't want
both
them there.
In the Senate and the House and those kinds of things. So first of all, they needed a quorum, 216 members. They got that. And the House leadership was able to deny Massey a second to his call on a roll call vote. So, indeed, the House of Representatives did pass this. It was passed by the Senate 2 days ago, passed by the House. Of course, the president will sign it. But I thought we'd go around the round table, hear first from Penna Dexter and then Debbie Georgiadis. This bill is stuffed full of wasteful spending, isn't it?
It is. I mean, we can talk about the part of it, sort of the core of it that's supposed to help, and do we think it will help? I mean, for instance, there's $350 billion for small businesses, and it's really a loan. It's loans to small businesses so they can make payroll. And if they retain these employees, some of these loans will actually be forgiven and they will be gifts. But it's just to get people, and when you think about that, that's one of the core goals here, is to keep businesses from suffering so much that they've got to lay people off. And then when this is over, they either can never open again, or they have a lot of trouble opening again, and they're not rehiring. So it's to make this 2 weeks not permanent, which is what we're all hoping, or however long it is. And so another part of this was $500 billion for mid-sized to large businesses. There was money for airlines. There's some restrictions placed on that, and then there's also some specific targeted money for companies like Boeing, even though that company was already having trouble. Then there's money for individuals. One-time checks, as Kirby mentioned, of $1,200 and then $500 per child. You don't get that. You don't get that full amount if you make over $75,000 a year. Or per individual, $150,000 per couple. So it's sort of prorated down. There's unemployment insurance. So there's extra money for those who are unemployed. This was sort of a point of contention. There's even unemployment insurance for people who are freelancers and work in the gig economy to help them out. And then there's money for states and localities. There's $100 billion for hospitals. So some of this, sort of rings true. You hate to see all this money spent, but I think we can just move to the other side of that. And there are many, many areas where there were battles, and some of them were won by the liberals and some were lost, to get a lot of their big government socialist agenda funded through this.
That was such a great summary. Honestly, I was taking notes while you were talking because I have read articles about what was supposedly going to be in the bill, and then it was the House version of the bill, and that wasn't going to go anywhere, and then what the Senate came up with, and now it's passed the House, and I didn't have all those details. I do think that the more money going directly to people who are directly harmed by this breakdown in our economy, people, the ones you described, they all sound wonderful. Maybe the airlines don't, but the individuals and businesses. But I love the concept that people have been talking about. This is a bridge to get you over a hard time in our economy, not a new norm, not the new way. And that is what the argument and concern is about socialism, cultural Marxism, whatever you want to call it. The idea that we're slowly agreeing that government really kind of runs everything, really kind of controls businesses, and you have freedom. You're not like in a communist country where you're forced to work someplace you don't want to work, but really the government's a growing and entrenched involvement in business. And so I love the concept of helping people short term to get through this. And certainly I think it is good that they capped the individual money checks above a certain level. If you're earning that, you don't need it. Right. I mean, everyone would be happy to take a check, I'm sure, but I mean, you don't need it. But I think the temporary idea of it, I wish it could be a, period, full stop. This is temporary statement, not this is the new norm, the new way we're going to go forward. Because I do think it's fraught with not just the idea of many things the left was trying to put into the bill that were more and more about pushing their agenda, but also with the growth in the expectation from the people that every time we have a problem, run into a problem in our business, somehow the government rescues us. I mean, this needs to be described as emergency, as unique, as one of a kind, a one-time thing. Is not the new norm every time we have a problem.
One of the things that Tom Giovannetti, who's been on this program, suggested is let's stop calling it a stimulus because it stimulates nothing. It's more back to the idea of a taking, and that is we have like eminent domain. Suppose your house is right in the way of where we would actually want to put a freeway. Well, we'll take your house, but we will reimburse you for the government expenses, and this is very different than 2008, where in some respects the banks and the housing industry did it to themselves. This is where the government said, we've got to shut you down, so we are going to provide this as a relief or as a rescue. And that maybe will help people understand why we look at this maybe a little differently than some of these other stimulus programs and all the rest. But still, $2.2 trillion. When we come back from the break, maybe we can talk about this a little bit more.
Funny money.
And funny money. And, of course, it is huge because you think about, wasn't it about $700 billion for that stimulus back in 2008? And we
thought
were all,
that was too much.
Yeah,
we
we're
had
all around the
protests in
table
Washington.
complaining. This is 3 times the larger. So all the way, phone calls are coming in. So I might as well open up the phones too. 1-800-351-1212. Perhaps you are upset with some of the money being spent, the amount, the debt. And then we're going to get into all sorts of other topics right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
A number of columnists and political thinkers have tried to explain why there is so much hate in the public arena. Shelby Steele is a senior fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution. He has some profound insights on why the left is consumed with hate. He takes us back to the 1960s when this country finally accepted that slavery and segregation were profound moral failings. So the left put itself in charge of righting this wrong, thus giving it enormous political and cultural power. It also led to the greatest array of government-sponsored social programs in history that have cost more than $22 trillion. He believes that this amounted to a formula for power that goes something like this. The greater the menace to the nation's moral legitimacy, the more power redounded to the left. Soon they had compiled a laundry list of menaces. Racism was at the top of the list, but other bigotry ending in ism and phobia were also making the list. This has created a problem for the left. America has made significant progress in racial issues along with progress with many other issues, and this threatens the left, whose existence is threatened by the diminishment of racial oppression. It must find racism anywhere it can in order to make itself relevant. The white-on-black shooting in Ferguson, Missouri got lots of media attention and even a comment from the President of the United States. During that same period, thousands of black-on-black shootings took place in Chicago, hometown of the then president, yet they inspired very little media coverage and no serious presidential commentary. Today, the left is troubled by its possible obsolescence. There is not enough social menace to service its need for power. It's easy to see why the left is consumed with hate. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kirby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Some of you have some questions about this bill, and some off the air are already starting to ask questions about the checks. So let me give the short answer now, and then we'll go into it in more detail later, because we have posted this article. Will people have to pay taxes on the money when they file their tax returns next year? No. The money is not counted as taxable income. It is treated as a fully refundable tax credit against your 2020 taxes, meaning that you get the money even if you don't have any tax liability, which leads to the next question somebody was asking. What if I, am on Social Security or I didn't file a tax? Again, in cases where people haven't filed tax returns but receive Social Security benefits or railroad retirement benefits, the IRS can look at statements about those benefits to help get those checks to those individuals. So that should answer your question. But for people who have not filed their 2018-2019 tax return, first of all, you're in trouble, but that's okay. And do not receive Social Security or railroad retirement benefits, there is still an incentive to promptly file a tax return to ensure the IRS can reach them to distribute the money to them. And I'll go into more of the details later, but I'm just trying to answer a couple of questions that are sort of off the air about this check. And if you find yourself saying, I want to read the whole thing, this one comes from The Hill, which is kind of the record for Capitol Hill, and it goes through all sorts of questions, which if we have time, I'll go through all of them, but I just wanted to sort of answer some of the questions we're getting as we open up the phones. Penna?
Well, one piece of information that might be helpful is that if you filed and if you got a refund and it was done by direct deposit, they have your direct deposit information. That's how you're going to get your money, which is quicker than them mailing checks.
Yes. So again, we'll talk about that and whether that $1,200 is appropriate and all sorts of things. But we also have a couple other questions, and so let me take one of those real quickly. We'll head out to North Carolina, WLGP. Lori, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Yes. Thank you for taking my call. I was wondering, I know that part of the plan, the proposal was to, the Democrats, wanted us to get rid of the Hyde Amendment. And I was wondering how that went, if you know, or if there's something we can read online.
Well, and there are a couple of things. First of all, there was an attempt, even by a few, to, in the Senate bill, actually have language that would have directly excluded Planned Parenthood, and a good resource for that is Josh Hawley. He is the senator from Missouri, and I'll just read what he said. I've been poring over the text of the relief bill, but I'm not happy negotiators took out the language that excluded Planned Parenthood from receiving government subsidies. Hope to get that back in there. But nevertheless, the original idea, Penna, you and I have talked about this before, is that the Hyde Amendment, and some people might say, what is that? Well, it goes all the way back to the 1980s. Henry Hyde, who is a representative, prohibits funds for elective abortion actually being paid for by our tax dollars. And so if you look at the supplemental appropriations, and also interesting enough, there's another thing in here which actually has an exclusion from small business loan assistance, and the way it's written, almost everybody thinks that it was an attempt to take Planned Parenthood out of receiving any kind of largesse, because since its affiliates taken together have 16,000 employees, then they wouldn't qualify for the 500 exclusion. So there's a couple of things that look like there were attempts in a more veiled way to prohibit Planned Parenthood. But back to your key issue, Penna, we talked about this 2 weeks ago, that the Hyde Amendment was something that was, I think, originally an intent by Nancy Pelosi to see if you could circumvent that. Is
right,
that fair?
And the Hyde Amendment applies to all of the distribution of money in this bill. And so I think that they were successful in keeping the Hyde Amendment operative in the distribution of funds in this bill, which is a good thing. And, the people that have been looking at this say there's no money going to Planned Parenthood in this, even though Josh Hawley's prohibition didn't go through, there still isn't. You may have talked about this, but in Texas and Ohio, because the governors ordered that the hospitals and surgery facilities should be cleared out to get ready in case you had patients coming in needing them with coronavirus. So people postponing surgeries that are elective surgeries. And so in both those states, abortion was included in those. So all abortion providers are basically shut down in Ohio and Texas because of coronavirus, which I heard Attorney General Paxton on the Texas Values, Jonathan Sainz, call this week, speaking about that. And, it's very, it's definitely a pro-life action, but it's really done to be fair with all the other surgery facilities. Why should you be allowed to have an abortion?
Good point. Since we're talking about that, Lori, I hope we answered your question there. We dodged a bullet on that. How about some others? Because originally Nancy Pelosi wanted to put in the bill early voting, same-day voter registration. What could be wrong with that? Bailout for all student loans, companies accepting assistance. At least a third of their board members must be chosen by the workers, wanting to evaluate the race and gender of those individuals, the disability, then having the individual airlines have to calculate the greenhouse gas statistics. All of that, of course, has a lot to do with coronavirus, doesn't it?
Not one thing. I did want to ask you, though, first of all, as a just pure matter of patriotic Americanism, people should be offended that we're in the middle of a crisis. We have specific actual needs of individuals, business owners, to get through this. The bill is designed to help people get through this crisis, and the left could not resist the opportunity to try to throw in some things they can't get through in other ways. It is truly despicable and selfish and should be punished by voters. But the one you mentioned, Kirby, I wanted to ask, you mentioned the one about same-day voting. There were numerous provisions with respect to elections that were in the House version. They were basically all making federal the standards that California has in its laws with respect to elections, and that just
ballot harvesting, all sorts of stuff.
Ballot harvesting, the whole lot of it. It is like we get to cheat kind of laws that it's like mail-in cheating. But I thought I read somewhere that in the Senate bill, the mail-in ballots mandating states to permit mail-in ballots survived in the Senate and was in this House bill. Is that not right?
I think they got rid of that one, but we can always double check. As far as I can tell, those provisions aren't, but maybe they slipped through. Let's hope they didn't, because that's one of the things that, and this is back to another point. We're talking about now a phase 4. I think even as people start reading through this and journalists start reading through it, we're going to find some other things, and we're going to have to fix the problems, right?
Right. And, one, I think, important point to make here is, see, we're in an election year, and so this is an important time to remember and make a campaign issue. What are you going to do all the way down the ballot to bring us back to normalcy? What are you going to do to repeal these temporary pieces of regulation and legislation that went into effect? That should be a campaign issue, and we ought to start talking it up now.
And again, let's talk about some things we do know made it in there. Of course, everybody's talked about the $25 million for the Kennedy Center, $75 million for the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, so Big Bird's going to be okay. How about $1 billion to Amtrak, $300 million to the Social Security Administration, $350 million for refugee resettlement? Those are in the bill, and some of this is, again, a perfect argument for line item veto, which, of course, was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. But we've got to figure out some way to allow a president, whoever it might be, whether it's Barack Obama or Donald Trump, to pull out some of this. It has nothing to do with coronavirus.
Well, I was going to come out strongly against even having a fourth bailout, a coronavirus bill, but actually, to get rid of some things is a good reason to have it. Nancy Pelosi is picturing it as something she's going to add more of the bad stuff back in. But among the many things that are offensive about what was included, the idea of refugee resettlement. We're trying to stop refugee resettlement. Yeah. We're trying to push back
we
on
need
that.
To stop
the country,
illegal immigration and refugee resettlement.
And yet we're funding it. It's like you have to have another bill that says, but we're banning all future refugee resettlement, so the money has nowhere to go. It is very troublesome. And actually, the particular item you mentioned, public broadcasting, but NPR, is that under public broadcasting, or is its own thing? Has NPR got some money? And
both of them did. PBS and NPR got under it because it's all under the corporation, so both of them did.
Okay, yes. So NPR has affiliates who are announcing they're no longer going to carry President Trump's coronavirus press conferences. So our tax dollars go to Washington and send to NPR so they can try to censor the president. Yes. Truly astonishing.
Yes, they decided just that it wasn't worth the viewers and the listeners' time, so they just simply decided not to. And yet we're spending our tax dollars for that. So
as far as a phase 4, Hugh Hewitt, columnist and radio host, thinks we need to have a phase 4 to respond to the purveyor of the plague, the Chinese Communist Party.
Well, and when we come back from the break, we'll get into some of that because, of course, there has been an attempt to have a class action suit against China. But also, I want to talk about these models. That's something we have been complaining about, and I've only mentioned it this week, and both these women are ready to talk about it. We'll be right back.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kirby Anderson.
Weekend edition. If you'd like to join our conversation, that number is 1-800-351-1212. Debbie Georgiadis Penedexter in studio with us today. Let me just mention our second article is one in which Dr. Deborah Bricks, who, by the way, hasn't she done an outstanding job?
Yes.
This piece talks about the fact that she wanted to sort of pop the coronavirus panic balloon. And part of that was she was a little bit concerned about some of the data being used. And so that's the second article, but one of the articles further down on our page we want to focus on, and Penn, I want you to kind of lead us through there because this comes from the Federalist, which not only points out this particular survey and study that was done at Imperial College in London, which we talked about a little bit earlier in the week and really raised some questions about, also has an interesting history as well. And yet its model, which is, I think, the worst case model that you can come up with, has been used by mayors, county judges, governors, and others. And it's based on a set of assumptions that may be assuming in every case the worst case scenario. And it's also put together by some individuals that have kind of an interesting background.
Well, Madeline Osborne at the Federalist put this together. And, of course, this model, it's a mapping tool called COVID Act Now. And it was put together by Democrat activists. And I'm just going to go to her conclusion first, just to kind of let you have that as a rubric under which to evaluate this. But she says perhaps the goal of COVID Act Now was never to provide accurate information, but to scare citizens and government officials into implementing rash and draconian measures. The creators even admit as much with their caveat that this model is designed to drive fast action, not predict the future. And as it's turning out, the model, which actually a lot of people have looked at this, it's been going around, and you can see the lines going up for various states, and it is very scary when you look at it. I mean, it's disturbing, and I remember getting my blood pressure up as I'm looking at the website. But it was built. It says itself, the website COVID Act Now, built to enable political leaders to quickly make decisions in their coronavirus response, and some of them did make quick decisions, perhaps too quick. And we're in Dallas, we're in Texas. Clay Davis, the county judge, announced a shelter-in-place order, and he put up on the screen the COVID Act Now graphs. They showed that after 3 months, if certain drastic measures are taken, that what the outcomes might be, and if they weren't taken, what they might be. And some of the other, for instance, okay, here's another one. The governor of Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer, who is a real Trump critic, she cited COVID Act Now when she told her state they would exceed 7 million cases in Michigan, with 1 million hospitalized and 460,000 deaths if the state did nothing. And then in Georgia, they used it to implement their policy. And what's happening now? Oh, Brian Kemp, he. Let's see, did he use that or not? I can't tell from this, but different states are using it, and they're predicting huge numbers of hospitalizations, huge number of deaths. In New York, COVID Act Now claimed nearly 5,400 New Yorkers would have been hospitalized by March 19th. Actual number by March 19th was 750. It claimed 13,000 New York hospitalizations by March 23rd. The actual number was 2,500. And so the numbers are not panning out the way COVID Act Now said. And some people are saying, well, that's because people are actually implementing these measures. And that could be part of it. But these are so out of whack now that you have to wonder whether or not these activists were actually trying to perpetuate and emphasize and overemphasize the crisis so that the cure could be, as we're actually talking about today, give the left the opportunity to solidify power, to take measures that the American people would normally not have been able to accept. And so I recommend that you read this. some of the critics point out that the Imperial Team's model doesn't account for the availability of tests or the possibility of super spreader events, which we know all about those. And we can talk later about possibly testing could start changing the equation on this thing.
That was a great summary. This article that is, again, the one you were speaking of, the Federalist article, I think it is, if you read one thing to try to understand why it may be the case that the virus and its impact on America is being used as a political tool to solidify left-wing power, to attack President Trump, and to really enable more draconian measures by local and state officials to control people. And I will get into the data more in a moment, but one point I want to be sure we talk about is that we are shaping now what we agree is permissible in the future, in future crises, by whether we just go along with everything the government orders or have more challenges. I'm not particularly suggesting civil disobedience. I am talking about the idea, though, that there should be more public outcry, more, there are petitions online, people sending things to the White House, suggesting different things. There needs to be more of a voice to local officials, wherever you are, if you are concerned that the measures that are applying to you are more draconian than are justified. There has to be some pushback, because otherwise we're kind of agreeing this is the path America is going down. On the particular case of this COVID Act Now, to be clear, COVID Act Now is not data from the CDC, from any state official, from the World Health Organization. It is data collected by individuals who are all left-wingers. They are left-wingers who support Hillary Clinton. One of them worked to put together a website to encourage whoever challenges Donald Trump to win in 2020 to have him be to support the opponent, Donald Trump. So these are very left-wing type people put together this COVID Act Now data, again, relying on that information, which is now being seriously questioned from Neil Ferguson, the UK epidemiologist who gave such drastic predictions about deaths and numbers of deaths and hospitalization. So it's an amazing thing. Society has been all the places you mentioned, Penn, and others too, as I mentioned earlier to our listeners, right, where we are in Dallas, Texas. You see a big chart, a scary chart, even the language they chose, frequent use of the term point of no return. If you don't do X by this, it's a point of no return, meaning we're all going to die, meaning the country
meaning they're not going to
over?
have enough room for all the patients.
Well,
probably.
but I mean, it's an alarming use of that terminology. And you can, to be clear, I know some of our listeners probably have read stories about the alarming situation in New York City, and some hospitals are overwhelmed.
In Italy.
And Italy. But even here in America, hospitals and places overwhelmed. And so we think, well, if that's true, then we have to do everything we can. But it can both be true that some hospitals are overwhelmed and we need more beds and we need more masks and we need more ventilators and we need more gowns. We need more medication. We need to move along a more testing kits. We need all those things. And still we are being fed draconian, alarming information that is causing us to easily surrender our civil liberties.
And you just mentioned a minute ago, since we have listeners in Georgia, it was actually somebody that sent something to Governor Brian Kemp saying, we're at the point of no return if you don't act. But again, for our listeners in Tennessee, the prediction would be 190 hospitalizations. And on the 19th of March, 15. If you take Georgia, the prediction was 800 confirmed cases, but fewer than 300 hospitalized. And you can go through this and begin to see, here are the predictions and here's the reality so far. And so, again, let's give credit where credit is due. Some of this might have been mitigated by shelter in place and social distancing, but some of the original assumptions in this model, which Neil Ferguson has been challenging, were based upon a much higher percentage of individuals contracting the virus, a much higher percentage of those who contract the virus actually getting sick and needing some kind of treatment, whether it was hospitalization or ICU. And so far, those numbers are much higher than anything we see.
Well, the death rate, too, because the death rate has been going down as we get more testing. And, that is part of the reason I think we accepted this, some of these plans, because we didn't have, unfortunately, the testing did not ramp up and get out there quickly. And so we weren't able to really see what was around us. We're starting to see more now what's around. And in some cases, it's not as much, probably most of the country. The places we hear about, New York being one, and of course the media is all in New York, so they're very focused on New York and what the situation, you see on Fox even the pictures of empty New York streets and empty parks. So, that was a flaw. It was too bad, but we've gotten pretty much past that now. But we're seeing the death rate is probably well under 1%. Instead of like 3%, as people were saying. So you're just not getting the seriousness, which was going to take people to the hospital and begin to overwhelm the system, is not happening to the degree that we thought. So now I think it's a good time to reevaluate.
Let's take a break. We will take some more phone calls, too. 1-800-351-1212. Be right back.
As we all adapt to social distancing, the new normal for daily living, we've also got to get serious about economic distancing from China. We have become too dependent on China in key sectors of our economy, like pharmaceutical and medical supply production. China's state news agency has issued several warnings that if the United States isn't careful, China could ban exports of pharmaceuticals and medical protective gear and throw our nation into, quote, a mighty sea of coronavirus. And they could do it. We depend on China for 80% of the core components we use to make our generic drugs. Generic drugs comprise 90% of the medicines Americans take. China also supplies more than 90% of the antibiotics we take, plus many other drugs and biologics that we depend upon. According to Rosemary Gibson, author of China RX, Exposing the Risks of America's Dependence on China for Medicine, China has pursued a deliberate strategy to disrupt, dominate, and displace advanced industries in the U.S. and other Western countries. One tool China uses for this purpose, she writes, are cartels, which work to undercut the prices other countries charge for things. China can do this because of its lower labor costs, weaker environmental regulations, and worker protections. An example of how this works is penicillin. The U.S. once produced 70% of the world's supply. Rosemary Gibson writes that in 2004, the Chinese cartel dumped the chemical material to make penicillin on the global market at below market prices, kept them low for 4 years, and drove out U.S. production. In fact, we are in the dangerous situation where production of practically all antibiotics and many other vital medicines has disappeared from the U.S. U.S. Senator Tom Cotton says it's time to pull America's supply chains for life-saving medicine out of China. He and Representative Mike Gallagher have introduced legislation to do so. This needs to be executed rapidly. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, Penna Dexter and Debbie Georgiadis. And while we're talking about this, again, this is an article that I would encourage you to read because it is in the Federalist. There are some other articles, by the way, in case you think that's just a one-off. I've got another one here that is an evaluation of this by epidemiologist Neil Ferguson, which, of course, Debbie mentioned just a minute ago. I've got another one here that has come out. Experts question the coronavirus models used by elected elected officials. That one, of course, is having to do with Clay Jenkins, who is the Dallas County judge. But all sorts of people have been quoting this. And even earlier in the week, I tried to give you kind of a point counterpoint, where at one point I mentioned that some people were really beginning to question the assumptions of the Imperial College study. And I contrasted that with some material that came out from some of our friends at the Discovery Institute, which would be Jay Richards and Doug Axe and others, that gave a much more optimistic view. And each time we do some evaluation, Penna, we notice that the fatality rate, or sometimes called the mortality rate, is decreasing. And that's due to the fact that, number one, we're having more and more people tested, and we find out that either they don't have the coronavirus, or we test them and find out they do have the coronavirus, but they're almost asymptomatic. So we recognize that some of those initial fears were based on what we didn't know, because China is not very transparent, right?
Yeah, and so we implemented these policies, and some seem draconian even now, 1 to 2 weeks later. So it's so new that I think it's time to reevaluate now before it becomes
the norm.
The norm, right.
Let's take some phone calls, too, along the way. Let's go up to the state of Alaska. KJNP. Ruth, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Yes, thank you for taking my call. A few days ago, I was on a telephone town hall meeting, and, of course, COVID-19 was on the agenda. And it was two Doctors Gross, one of whom, the gentleman, is running for office. And the question was asked, about symptoms, how can I know that I have it without testing, and so on. And Dr. Gross said something interesting. She said, the initial, you get a dry cough, and then you're going to have a high fever, and here came the interesting part. Well, just stay home, drink lots of fluids. Hot fluids are nice. That'll get you through it, and you don't really need to go to the hospital. 80% of cases you can take care of at home.
Right. That's what we've been seeing
that too. Yes.
Kind of like a normal flu. Yes.
Yeah.
So don't rush to besides, the hospital's not exactly a safe place for you to go if you don't have it.
Yeah. And, she said, and I also heard on, another radio program, this COVID-19, the way it's working out, it's not nearly as bad as the Spanish flu of 100 years ago.
Oh, of course not. Yeah.
Because, the Spanish flu was indiscriminate in who was killed and who wasn't, basically. But this one, we can predict who's going to take it hard, and those of us who are relatively young and relatively healthy, just stay home, lots of fluids, try not to give it to somebody else. And
it can be bad. And I have a friend, I only really know one person that tested positive that has it at this point. And she went to New York, and she came back sick. And she had pneumonia. She was tested, and she had pneumonia. It took a week and a half for her to get her results for her COVID-19 test, and she was positive. And it's been terrible, but it's not been bad enough to go to the hospital. She stays in touch with her doctor. She feels her, she can feel it in her lungs. It's very painful. The exhaustion, pure, utter exhaustion. But the doctor's just given her a point where if you start to have trouble breathing, that's when you go. Otherwise, we really can't do a whole lot for you at a hospital. So you're better off doing the things that that Ruth just mentioned with hot fluids and just rest. And I know one thing about viral pneumonia, and that is you do feel exhausted and you do need to rest. You shouldn't be really doing anything. You just should rest.
Ruth, I appreciate you bringing that up because it's a good illustration of that. And the second article is one that I just mentioned a minute ago, in which Dr. Birx was, in some respects, criticizing the media. So let's go down to, I guess it would be the fourth article there. Americans think media has done a terrible job covering this crisis. And the Gallup poll came out the other day. And which ones do you think have been doing the best job of handling the coronavirus? U.S. hospitals at the top, and then the schools, the government, Even the president is much higher, and at the very bottom was the news media. What a surprise.
Actually, I kind of have my faith in the American people restored or confirmed by that polling. I do think I see so many headlines that are alarming. It's
Yes.
like the media it's a sensation. I know that sensationalism sells, and it's not exciting to have a headline story that's a beautiful day outside today. I mean, they have to have something that's alarming, but so many of the headlines are alarming, and they are worded in a way when you finally read through the article that caption wasn't really justified. I saw the most clever thing someone sent out. It was a hospital in Italy today or yesterday, and there was a video of a woman who was being released from the hospital having gotten through coronavirus. They said 739 people were released with the coronavirus having gotten through it. They're completely healthy again. And the hospital staff had lined up and they were clapping as she was going by in the wheelchair, waving. And someone was saying, why isn't that a headline? And so as to the media, I am glad to hear a little pushback against the media. I know they have to find catchy or somehow spicy headlines to entice people, but they are contributing to the pandemic of fear, and it is. I'm glad that people are turned off by that.
Well, we mentioned earlier New York, and you look at a lot of the stories, and I don't know what the numbers are today, but leading up to this few day period right now, New York's had really half the cases.
Yes.
And so, so if you're going to be in New York, you're national media, you're in New York, you're experiencing it more. So you have to just even consider that bias, that most of the major media outlets are in New York, and it's there. They're not in Texas. They're not in, the middle of the country in Kansas or Nebraska. Or I heard someone from Wyoming yesterday say, we don't have any here. So there's a lot of places where it's not a factor, but they're still they still got some rules put on them.
Yeah, interestingly too about we're all going through this in our country. I was mentioning on the break, talking to Penna, how I saw an article that was talking about how this is actually right now one of the worst flu seasons America's had in decades. A horrible flu season, and the numbers are terrible in terms of number of people contracted, infected, becoming ill, even passing on. The numbers are terrible. But because of coronavirus, we're not even paying attention to that. And just as a contrast, I think it'd be helpful if the media, it doesn't play into their creation of fear to report about the flu, because it does start to make you think, well, gee, right now in America, you're far more likely to contract and die of the flu than you are of coronavirus. But the media, somehow that doesn't interest them. This is this novel, it's almost sexy thing because it's exotic and from a foreign country and is unknown. But it adds to the environment of fear by not putting things in those factual contexts.
Let me just mention that if you'd like to know those numbers, and again, 128,000 people worldwide that have recovered, but we have a link today to the coronavirus Johns Hopkins map, and so you can zoom in and find out what's happening in your community and look at the total numbers. And even though the press isn't talking about the people that have recovered, I thought I'd tell you 128,000 have so far, and more to come. We'll be back right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @Point of View RTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kirby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, first of all, I think y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kirby Anderson.
This hour we're going to take some more phone calls. 1-800-351-1212. Penna Dexter, Debbie Georgiadis. And let me just mention, since we probably won't get into it too much, is the third article there is called Creativity and Compassion Continued to Combat the Coronavirus. I love the alliteration there, but if nothing else, it reminds us that we are, in many cases, dependent on this public-private partnership the president has put together, which I think is a great idea. Many of the pharmaceutical firms are working at lightning speed to develop a vaccine. You know, those are the big pharma ones that everybody in the Democratic presidential debates will like to vilify. They're talking about one laboratory will soon release lab-on-chip kits to test patients for 3 kinds of coronavirus. We need all sorts of face masks, so companies nationwide are shifting resources to produce more masks. 3M, for example, has ramped up to produce more of these N95 respirators, doubling our global output to a rate of more than 1.1 billion per year. And so if we're going to have some solutions, Penna, it's going to come from the private sector.
That's right. And it's been gratifying to hear some of it. I remember when President Trump, I think it was earlier this week or last week, and he was being questioned by a reporter about the defense bill that was passed in 1950 during the Korean War, I think, to repurpose businesses to produce wartime necessities. And so that bill is still in effect, and President Trump made it so he can tap that bill if he needs to. And so a reporter was castigating him for not doing so yet. And his response was just wonderful to a person who loves free markets and hates big government. And that was that companies have been calling the White House and Congress and even him personally to offer to do just that, to repurpose their manufacturing to make masks or ventilators or, things that are needed for this fight against the coronavirus. We don't need to use this bill. We don't need to expand government in this way because private companies are stepping up to the plate.
I love that news conference too, that little clip. It was really great because it was President Trump he, as he often does, he repeats things and gives several examples of repeats things, which is kind of entertaining. But he was saying, how do we as a government know which company, why would I tell X company, you're the ones, you're going to make ventilators? Companies know what they're good at, what they're capable of doing, what they can easily shift to. So the one little company that was just one among many, but MyPillow has stepped up and said, well, they've got all this fabric. We can make masks. So they're making tons of masks. I've forgotten the numbers, but they're making masks. And companies who previously made ventilators, so we could do that again, or we could just adjust this. And I just love that. It is that American spirit of we can fight this. We're going to step up. Businesses are just people. They're just people, a lot of people in some cases, and they're perfectly capable, and they want to be part of this. There's no one on the side of coronavirus. Everyone wants to get everything done we need to get done. I love that. And that it was the Defense Production Act that he was being asked about, the DPA, and he said, I have it ready to go if I have to, but I don't think I should need to, and I love that.
And I think when some companies start doing it, it becomes sort of a cascading effect.
Well, me too, yeah.
Yeah, me too. So there's this other group that formed a nonprofit very quickly, and this actually was sent out by the White House. It's not a White House or government initiative. It's private, but it's called COVID Promise, and it's actually officially launching right now at 3 p.m. Eastern time. And it's for people to send in videos of what they've done to help rebuild the economy. So just, small businesses or individuals for people to send these videos into this COVID promise, and so that people can see this and see what people are doing, and to sort of boost the private entrepreneurial spirit in this country, something that's made us great and something that's been, of necessity in some cases tamped down right now.
So again, we'll probably cover some of that next week in our Truth Team, because I always like to give you some positive stories. Distillers that are producing hand sanitizer, and 3M producing all sorts of masks. Let's take some phone calls, though. If you'd like to join us, that number is 1-800-351-1212. I'll try to answer some of the questions about the coronavirus checks, and that, again, I think is the 5th article on our website today. But Paul in Georgia, what is your question?
Yes, sir. I was calling about the people that's on a fixed income, as far as workman's comp, Social Security, disability, and retirees. Are they entitled to some part of the stimulus?
Yes, they are. And let me try to answer that as best I can. And Penna, let's work our way through that. I mean, I don't have to be the only voice here, but first of all, will people have to pay taxes on the money when they file their tax returns? And the answer is no. I said that last hour, but I know people are tuning in and tuning out. And this is not counted as taxable income. It's treated kind of as a fully refundable tax credit. But then back to Paul's question, which is similar to some of the other questions we've had off air. I think Ray in Arizona asked this as well. Can people get checks even if they haven't filed a tax return in recent years? Now, you should file your tax return, but some people, if you're below that level, then you may not. But the bottom line is, if you're already receiving a couple of different benefits, for example, if you receive Social Security benefits, if you receive railroad retirement benefits, then, of course, that would be the case. And so those are ways in which you would obviously receive
So they're going to
that.
get the information from those
Right.
statements that they've got at the government somewhere.
Yes, somewhere. People who do not file tax returns are typically low income, as it points out. And so the IRS requires married couples with both spouses, if they make a certain amount, to pay for that. Are immigrants eligible? Well, yes, if they have a Social Security number. I had to look at Debbie when I looked at that one. I knew it was a reaction there. Are college students eligible to receive the checks? That's another question people have asked. Well, if a college student's at least 17 years of age, and are claimed as a dependent on their parents' return, their family would not receive any payment for them. But a college student who has filed his or her own return and was not claimed as a dependent then would qualify for the rebate. So it is there. And Penny, you pointed out a couple others. First of all, a lot of people say, well, is the check going to come in the mail? No, because if you've been paying your taxes with direct deposit, I think that's the 5th question there, you would receive it in the same way, wouldn't you?
Yes, you would, which would be the quickest way to get it. But otherwise, you would get a check, and those are going to take a little bit longer. So how long will it take to get your money? That's another question.
Yes, go for it.
It's unclear, but several weeks, possibly months, is what most experts are saying. Treasury Secretary Mnuchin says the checks could arrive starting April 6th. So that's not that long to wait, really.
Oh, it's coming right up. I hate to be a naysayer. Why would college students who are not employed get a check? How are they disrupted?
They might be working at Starbucks or something like that.
And part of this is that children, families are getting $500 for each child.
Right.
Now, that would go to the parents, though, I think.
Mm-hmm. Well, and again, one other one that people are asking about is, we were saying, well, if you are a single filer and you make more than $75,000, does that mean I don't get anything? No, if you made $99,000, you wouldn't. But for every $100 over $75,000, they would take that off. So if you, for example, had an adjusted gross income of $85,000, you would receive $700 instead of $1,200. So you can figure that out. And if nothing else, since I see that we have a break coming up here, let me just mention this goes on for 2 pages. And so we read a few of the answers, but if you'd like some more, we've made it available on our website, pointofview.net. And let's take a break, because I want to talk about, are we ever going to reopen America again, get people back to work? What's that going to mean? So we'll talk about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
A number of columnists and political thinkers have tried to explain why there is so much hate in the public arena. Shelby Steele is a senior fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution. He has some profound insights on why the left is consumed with hate. He takes us back to the 1960s when this country finally accepted that slavery and segregation were profound moral failings. So the left put itself in charge of righting this wrong, thus giving it enormous political and cultural power. It also led to the greatest array of government-sponsored social programs in history that have cost more than $22 trillion. He believes that this amounted to a formula for power that goes something like this. The greater the menace to the nation's moral legitimacy, the more power redounded to the left. Soon they had compiled a laundry list of menaces. Racism was at the top of the list, but other bigotry ending in ism and phobia were also making the list. This has created a problem for the left. America has made significant progress in racial issues along with progress with many other issues, and this threatens the left, whose existence is threatened by the diminishment of racial oppression. It must find racism anywhere it can in order to make itself relevant. The white-on-black shooting in Ferguson, Missouri got lots of media attention and even a comment from the President of the United States. During that same period, thousands of black-on-black shootings took place in Chicago, hometown of the then president, yet they inspired very little media coverage and no serious presidential commentary. Today, the left is troubled by its possible obsolescence. There is not enough social menace to service its need for power. It's easy to see why the left is consumed with hate. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kirby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Want to make this an open line, although we certainly, of course, have Penna Dexter and Debbie Georgiadis, but nevertheless, I want to give some of you a chance to ask a question, and I know we have one here before we get into another aspect of this. Boy, we have covered a lot of ground already, but we haven't talked about what it looks like trying to get America back to work, what it means to reopen America as we had at one time. But let me take one more phone call before we do that. Larry in South Carolina on the Good News Network. Thank you for listening today. What's your question?
Well, I was kind of concerned about the vaccines because after watching this YouTube thing that was in back in '92 and Agenda 21, the vehicle for hidden agenda, and it was talking about cutting the population. So me and my friends, we kind of concerned about the doctors taking the first jump into taking all the doctors take the vaccine first. All the doctors and nurses. And also
they have to be tested. The vaccines have to be tested. It's required.
Sure. And let me talk about that because you've raised a good question because before they're going to put that vaccine in me, I want to know what they've done. And there's a phase 1, and that's interesting because phase 1 testing, and I'm not a doctor. I don't play a doctor on radio, but I grew up around a medical family. My grandfather was a doctor. My father was in pharmaceuticals, and I've been paying attention to some of this. The phase 1 is where actually they give the vaccine to very healthy people. You might say, why would they bother to do that? Because they want to see if there are what are called contraindications or whether there are any issues in terms of a person's immune system. So phase 1 will be where you have pretty healthy people actually taking it. Phase 2 then is where you spread it out over a number of individuals of different ages, demographics, health backgrounds, and the rest who are maybe positive for the coronavirus. So, Larry, long before that one gets to you or anybody else in your community, it does. But that's kind of that's why right now, even though they've been working on some of these vaccines, one in Israel, I know your husband, Debbie, go to Israel. Of course, Penn and I have been there a few times. It's amazing all the things happening in the medical and biotech industry there in Israel. So one of them is there, one of them is in the United States. Of course, meantime, they're, of course, using the malaria tablets as a way to treat some of this. But nevertheless, the vaccine is going to take a while to actually be implemented before we could even make it readily available.
Oh, the vaccines do take a long time because of what Penn and you are both saying. Yeah, they definitely do testing. I know some people are suspicious of vaccines, and I'm not judging any of that. But I think in this case, given how coronavirus was sprung on the world and it shocked the world and it took a lot of lives and it has a sense of being out of control, I think there may be more openness for people to go after, once this vaccine has been tested and approved, for people to take it than maybe the regular flu virus. I think, people are very worried about the coronavirus and very worried about the social distancing and how contagious, which is due to how contagious it seems to be. So, yeah, I don't, I know people have a variety of reasons not to care for vaccines, but I think in this case, there'll be I think they'll do thorough testing and there'll be a very welcoming attitude on the part of the public for the most part.
I think so, too, because this is a new virus that no one's immune to in the world until it hit just now, we don't think. And so there's just going to be a lot of susceptibility to that virus. And I think also the vaccine will be, I'm not an epidemiologist, but it seems like it would be very specific, much more specific than the flu vaccine, which sometimes you get it, but you don't know if the flu that's going to come around that year is going to be exactly that one. But I would think that this coronavirus, this COVID-19 vaccine would probably be more specific and perhaps more effective. I think one of the hopes is that the warm weather will tamp things down, and then once we get back into the cold weather, the vaccine will be a little further along in being tested and be available soon.
And again, some research that was done by John Lott originally we talked about. How about those two Stanford scientists that also looked at that as well? Both have Indian names, which I'm not even going to try to pronounce since I don't have the piece of paper in front of me, but those are the cases. I do want to get on in just a minute to what normal looks like again, but okay, let me put my scientific geek hat on for another minute. It is possible that if indeed people have been tested positive for the coronavirus and have recovered, you could come up with maybe an antibody test to say, well, you don't need the vaccine because you've already actually developed the antibodies for it. But the provisor for that, and I won't get any more scientific than this, is if indeed the COVID-19 virus mutates, you might not necessarily have complete protection from it. Because some people have suggested right now, let's take 127,000, now it's 128,000 people worldwide that are not going to get the coronavirus. Let's put them back to work. Well, there's no evidence to suggest that because you've recovered from it, you wouldn't get it again. There's no evidence necessarily that it could mutate again. So we just have a few scientific questions still to try to answer.
Oh, absolutely true. This actually harkens back to an earlier point, but you reminded me of it when you were talking about people who have gotten through coronavirus, contracted it, gotten through it, and recovered. In New York City, they're starting to collect blood samples from people who, who have have recovered. And the great thing was, and that's one article describing it, was how enthusiastically so many people immediately responded, said, sure, I'll help. They came to give blood samples with the notion that perhaps this can be part of developing these people's healthy blood.
The blood plasma would actually give you antibodies. Yeah.
And so I love that. It's a little bit like companies jumping up and saying, sure, we can make masks, we can make ventilators. People are they want to help, and anything to contribute toward the cure is a wonderful thing.
That is so good. Okay, let's get on to this issue. We've posted a couple of articles here. A couple of days ago, I quoted from one by Andrew Studiford, who was trying to look down the road. And not many people do that. I've always said around this program, for every person worried about the end of the world, there's 1,000 people worried about the end of the month. But let's look down the road a little bit, and let's say, what does this look like? Ultimately, consumer spending is accountable for about 70% of GDP. Now, if we come out of lockdown and people go back to work, that would help the economy, given the fact right now they're predicting that the GDP for the second quarter will be a minus 24% at a time when it used to be 3 or 4%. But that would suggest that the economy would come roaring back, but the people aren't going to necessarily have the resources. They may be in more debt, or they may be still trying to get started, businesses getting started. So instead of this looking like a V, like Kelly Shackelford was suggesting last week, maybe it's going to look more like an elongated U. But nevertheless, What about this? Can we start thinking about what it would be like to actually go back to something that looks like normal?
Absolutely. And the sooner the better. The sooner the better. The idea that people who are healthy, who don't have any reason to feel or fear they are particularly susceptible to coronavirus, those people should be going back to work. I mean, you have to wait till everything is legal and businesses are open, but the longer we go with a system where we're just kind of muddling through, relying on the government, waiting to be told what to do, the more entrenched we get in kind of a sense of helplessness and weakness. There was a great point. I mean, people have been talking about, since the government shut everything down, and it's very hopscotchy around the country, but much of the economy has been shut down because of this virus. We have to be getting toward a plan to reopen that is some formula we agree on, because some people Nancy Pelosi has articulated, well, until we have this coronavirus, she didn't say exactly completely eliminated, but somewhere close to that. We can't wait that long to bring the economy back. We've got to have the different expressions people use. We need a formula. We need a game plan. We need a date certain. We need something that says to the people, this is what we're going to try to do. And I know we'll probably get into the next segment, but I thought it was a great thing that there are more voices out there in this country saying that the damage to people from a failed economy, from a disastrous depression-level economy, is at least as harmful and more harmful than the virus has been. So we have to start with the premise, we must get back to work. Healthy people must be permitted to get back to work and figure out a plan from there rather than a too tiptoeing cautious plan.
We just have a minute before the break, but I'm just looking at several different people speaking that message. For instance, Ben Shapiro, America needs a formula for reopening. And then Daniel Johnson and Robert Moffat at Daily Signal there with Heritage. Yes, we can strike the right balance amid the COVID-19 crisis. This is a great piece. We've got it posted, A Plan to Get America Back to Work by Thomas Friedman. And another article, We Must Plan for How to Get Back to Business Later. Some people sooner, some people later. I'm all for surgically starting to get back sooner. A lot sooner.
Yeah. I know we're going to get to it in the next segment, but A Plan to Get America Back to Work was especially compelling in that a doctor is laying out what actually sounds like common sense your grandmother would have said.
Yes. Well, let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll focus on that for a while. And I might just mention Penna Dexter's commentary will be coming up at the quarter to the top of the hour on China and medicines. That's another thing. Can we begin to restructure our supply chain? We'll be right back.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kirby Anderson.
Final half hour. If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Penna Dexter, Debbie Georgiadis, and we'll get some more calls, but we also want to talk about what the plan for the future looks like. But I thought I'd also give you a preview for next week, and that is it'll be our Truth Team. And certainly during that time, we want to challenge you to consider what you might do to support this ministry. And I know many of you have told us that actually we've become your lifeline. You're stuck at home. You're not able to get out. You get a chance to hear some of this material. And so we recognize some of you are facing some of those financial issues that we have actually talked about. And so we're hoping that others of you might be able to step up. And one of the many things I've been talking about this week is that we have this little flash drive. It's an unusual one because it has a carabiner, so you can actually clip it onto your belt or your purse. I'm suggesting if you have kids going off to college, they can clip it onto the backpack. It has 2 different USBs, so it doesn't matter even which kind of computer you have. But on it are a number of the booklets that we have, a dozen different booklets, 16 different Outlook articles, totaling 59 pages, some of those by Penna, by me, by a variety of others. We have 24 or 24 of my Viewpoints commentaries, and we have the best articles that we could find as well as programs on here. And there are 19 programs, so that's 11 hours of material you can listen to. It's on culture, economy, life issues, politics, religious freedom, theology, and apologetics. So if you find yourself having a conversation with somebody saying, I think socialism is a good idea, you can listen to the interview with Jay Richards, or you can see the booklet on socialism. You might have somebody who says, I think I wouldn't necessarily want to marry somebody of the same gender, but I guess that's something they should do. And you wonder, what's the answer to that? That is the case. And if you have a young person going off to college, or even if they're in high school right now, clip it to their backpack and they will have access to all that material. So that's one of the many things we're giving out next week, just as a thank you, along with we're giving away Joe Rosenberg's book and all sorts of other things. So that's next week. So I hope you'll be tuning in, listening in, and the rest. But before I take some more phone calls, what about this? We mentioned just a minute ago, we have the piece by Ben Shapiro, Thomas Friedman. The concern I have, and Ben Shapiro has that quote from the governor, Andrew Cuomo, saying, wait a minute, my mother's not expendable, your mother's not expendable. We will not put a dollar figure on human life. No one should be talking about social Darwinism for the sake of the stock market. There's always going to be some argument that even as we begin to try to return back to normal, some people are saying you're hard-hearted, you don't care about people. Well, there's a balance between caring about people and also not completely devastating the economy that we find ourselves in right now. And it's a tough balance. I understand that.
Since when is keeping the economy strong not caring about people? When you think about the wonderful raise in employment in all sectors of the economy, the sectors that weren't doing as well, all minorities have, under this president and since the tax cut, have increased their share of being in the workforce. So it makes your life better to be able to have a good economy. And that goes all the way down to the lowest earning person in the culture. So, yes, it's important to protect people's health, but it's detrimental to protect, to just go as far as you can to protect health, and you have no economy that people can live and thrive in. There's a balance. I mean, there's always been a balance. This is not like we're making a draconian choice now and we've never made one before. We've always had to balance resources with the needs, and sometimes the need isn't as great. And we have presented folks with some errors in some of the modeling that we've been using to craft the plan that's in effect right now for 2 weeks. Some of it, in some areas of the country, it may be a little overkill. We don't know. But it's been there. And if it's done good, great. It's just that it cannot last forever. And I think the statement by the president, we cannot let the cure be worse than the problem itself, says it all.
Love that summary. I analogized a moment ago on the show to the numbers of the flu, the regular annual flu that seems to come around versus a coronavirus. The flu kills more people every year than coronavirus ever has. It kills up in this season alone, the low estimate from the CDC is it's killed 24,000 people. We don't say because the flu season is out there that everyone has to stay home. Because if everyone stays home, we don't have an economy, we don't have businesses, we don't have jobs, we don't have income. And so life has inherent risks. And the flu just being a good analogy to this particular coronavirus issue. It's just the nature of life that you go out your front door. You may know someone who passed on in a car accident, but you still don't say, therefore, I'll never drive a car again. I mean, you engage and you get out there in the world. And Penn, I'm glad you made that point about the economy, because I think a lot of the kind of cheap political points are made sometimes when people just say things like, I care about people more than the economy. I'm not greedy. I care about grandma more than greedy money. The economy is not about greed. It's about whether individual families and individual people can live in comfort, that they can earn sufficient income so they can have a roof over their head and food on their table and purchase the things their family needs. Human comfort in life that we want everyone to have is premised on it needs a robust economy to give that opportunity to the most people. So the economy isn't about greed and money. It's about the entire culture and way we function as a people in this country by having jobs that pay us, and then we can then use that money to put food on the table and do all the things we have to do for our families. So, yeah, it is. We're always making those judgment calls. We had a very extreme reaction to coronavirus because it was unknown and alarming, and we were watching things in China and Italy. But, yes, we get to the point where we realize that the economy is grinding to a halt, and that means actual human suffering if you don't get the economy back on track.
Yes. What about Thomas Friedman? That was one of the articles we have here, and he's talking about a backlash. He said, if my inbox is any indication, a thoughtful backlash is brewing to the strategy the country has stumbled into. And stumbling is what inevitably happens when you have a president who goes from treating the coronavirus as a hoax. I didn't know he did that. To a war in the space of 2 days. First of all, this is one of the many inaccurate reportings that have been taking place, and we went through those lists, and it has been amazing. Just the other day I ran through all of those, most of which have come from the former vice president who's running against this president, that has earned a lot of four Pinocchios, a lot of false from PolitiFact and even the AP. But nevertheless, is there a backlash? I mean, I think over time people have said, I'm willing to stay shelter in place, but I wonder if eventually people are going to say, I have got to get out and we've got to get back to work, right?
We do have to get back to work. And I mentioned the word surgically, and this has not been a surgical reaction. It's been an across-the-board reaction. Mm-hmm. And now we're seeing, as we look at the numbers, we have a lot more information. Testing is out there. We're seeing numbers. We're seeing who's entering the hospital, who's staying home, who's getting well. And so we can see where the virus is at its worst and where you need to have a stronger reaction and where you can begin to allow more freedom. So Friedman says he asked the question, can we surgically minimize the threat of this virus to those most vulnerable while we maximize the chances for as many Americans as possible to safely go back to work as soon as possible? One expert I talked to, he says, believes that it could happen as early as a few weeks if we pause for a moment and think afresh about the coronavirus challenge. I think this is an opportune moment for that.
I do too, and I think that article, again, I really commend it to all of our listeners. Every article that is up on the Point of View website, I'm sure, is wonderful, but this particular one really, it both lays out logical arguments and it also is able to respond to some of the more silly characterizations. But again, it's called A Plan to Get America Back to Work. The suggestion at its core that he is going with is one that was made by this Dr. David L. Katz, who's founding director of Yale University, CDC-funded Yale Griffin Prevention Research. And this is what I said before in the last segment. It's kind of like what your grandmother would have said. He's basically saying instead of shutting everyone in at home, protect the people who are vulnerable, who are either ill or vulnerable. have our policy protect them. He uses fancy language and talks about how we need to pivot from horizontal interdiction to vertical interdiction.
I like that analogy, though.
Well,
we're doing horizontal right now, right?
Yeah, right. Oh, yeah. It's the same thing grandmother has said. If you feel fine, go to work and stop, and if you don't feel fine, you're feeling ill, stay home, protect people who are vulnerable. No, it is a good visual, vertical versus horizontal, but the basic concept is if you're not feeling ill and you want to go to work, you ought to get to go to work and let our policy shift to protecting people who are vulnerable, who are ill, who are or fearful. If you're fearful and you want to stay home, fine. But this notion that we shift our approach, I think it is consistent with common sense, but it is really is vital. And I think actually this kind of thinking is penetrating at the White House. It's penetrating Dr. Birx, who's advising the president. It's penetrating a lot of levels, I think.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, you might want to listen to Penna Dexter's commentary right now, and it has to do with the whole issue of China and medicines, and that's part of this kind of long-term strategy, too. Do we need to rethink our supply chains? And we'll come back and take some phone calls right after this.
As we all adapt to social distancing, the new normal for daily living, we've also got to get serious about economic distancing from China. We have become too dependent on China in key sectors of our economy, like pharmaceutical and medical supply production. China's state news agency has issued several warnings that if the United States isn't careful, China could ban exports of pharmaceuticals and medical protective gear and throw our nation into, quote, a mighty sea of coronavirus. And they could do it. We depend on China for 80% of the core components we use to make our generic drugs. Generic drugs comprise 90% of the medicines Americans take. China also supplies more than 90% of the antibiotics we take, plus many other drugs and biologics that we depend upon. According to Rosemary Gibson, author of China RX, Exposing the Risks of America's Dependence on China for Medicine, China has pursued a deliberate strategy to disrupt, dominate, and displace advanced industries in the U.S. and other Western countries. One tool China uses for this purpose, she writes, are cartels, which work to undercut the prices other countries charge for things. China can do this because of its lower labor costs, weaker environmental regulations, and worker protections. An example of how this works is penicillin. The U.S. once produced 70% of the world's supply. Rosemary Gibson writes that in 2004, the Chinese cartel dumped the chemical material to make penicillin on the global market at below market prices, kept them low for 4 years, and drove out U.S. production. In fact, we are in the dangerous situation where production of practically all antibiotics and many other vital medicines has disappeared from the U.S. U.S. Senator Tom Cotton says it's time to pull America's supply chains for life-saving medicine out of China. He and Representative Mike Gallagher have introduced legislation to do so. This needs to be executed rapidly. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and again, I mentioned Penna Dexter's commentary. We'll get to that in just a minute, but let's take a phone call or two. In Florida, Rick, what would you like to add to our conversation today?
Well, thank y'all, Kirby, for all you do, and thank you for taking my call, and thank you for being a voice of truth whenever we're hearing a bunch of lies from the other media.
Thank you.
But anyway, I just want to say, that we need to be thanking God that we got a man like Donald Trump in the White House during this crisis time, somebody that's level-headed, somebody that's a businessman, somebody that's a leader, somebody that thinks out of the box. And I also believe that this should solidify his reelection in 2020. And also, the way hopefully our 46th president is doing, which is Mike Pence, that may solidify his reelection because he's taking the bull by the horns also and doing a good job there. So I think that China, the media, the Democrats, have all blown this thing out of proportion, and it's just something that we're having to go through. I know it's bad, and I wouldn't want any of my loved ones to get it, or I just pray for everybody that does have it, that God intervene on their behalf. But we have more that's killed by the flu than this, so we need to be thinking about getting the economy back going.
We do. That's what we'll talk about a little bit. But Debbie, let me come to you for just a minute. I mean, there have been a lot of things thrown against this president, the Mueller investigation, whether it's Russia, whether it's then later, of course, Ukraine and the impeachment. And now they think COVID-19. But the president's approval is higher than it's ever been, as far as I can tell.
Which may account for the NPR move to say they're going to stop covering his press conferences. But actually, on a very serious note, I do think that first of all, earlier, someone was mentioning how the argument had been made that President Trump said this whole COVID-19 was a hoax. He didn't say that. But he is starting to recognize that the left, Nancy Pelosi and others, are using the fact of this unfortunate virus as another means to attack him. It is just a playground for someone determined to attack him because so many decisions have to be made, standards have to be set, policy has to be announced, and there are always ways a Monday morning quarterback can say, well, if he only hadn't said this, if he had done this, and people who don't like him have been piling on and all over media claiming that, well, if he'd only done this 2 weeks earlier or this or this or this. So they're trying to use a virus as a means to attack him and to attach any number of deaths in America to his presidency. So yeah, it's almost like coup number 3. I mean, coup number 1 being the Mueller investigation, coup 2 being the impeachment, and here we are. It will be used by the left to try to destroy him. And at least so far, you're right. The poll numbers are showing the American people are seeing through that. They're saying, he's doing a good job. It's the media we don't like very well.
Yeah, they pick at things, and this is not the kind of president that just reacts to that. He usually pretty much stays the course in what he thinks is right, which is pretty refreshing, actually. And so, I think it helps a lot that when you consider the alternative, giving video chats out of his basement and just getting everything wrong, people just don't have a lot of confidence in what the other party is offering. And, can't even imagine a Joe Biden leading the country through this. I mean, President Trump is leading us. He's not nobody could be perfect in this situation because there's so many unknowns. But he's been bold and he's been willing to put one foot in front of the other and get the best experts out there and encouraging private enterprise and private business. I think only a businessman could understand how that can work in a crisis like this. There may be no other person that could have understood and employed and allowed that to flourish and thrive the way he has.
And one of the things the media is trying to do is to drive a wedge between President Trump and this Dr. Fauci, the NIH guy. And it's so interesting because, I'm sure you talk about in the show, but Dr. Fauci has a bizarre fondness for Hillary Clinton. But leaving that aside, his, infatuation with her, media has been saying that Fauci is grumbling behind the scenes and doesn't like being limited by Trump, and Trump doesn't listen to him. But the fact is, and as Dr. Fauci said several times recently, I can't imagine anyone, in fact, he said it in an interview a couple of days ago, I can't imagine anyone better handling this job and the virus better than Donald Trump. I can't imagine anything better. He is not true that he ignores me. It's not true that he doesn't listen to what I say. It really is a very direct refutation of all this. But I think that trying to paint President Trump as someone who gets rid of real advisors and lines himself up with people who already agree with him, that is not and consistent with what the truth is at this time.
Let's, if we can, just real quickly talk about Penna's commentary, because this is one place where I think Donald Trump was saying, we need to bring our supply chains back to the United States. And Penna's got a piece that reminds us that at one time the United States produced 70% of the world's supply of penicillin, but now 80% of the core components that make up our generic drugs are made right there in China.
Yeah, and that's really exposed that situation with regards to our drugs and our prescription medicines, and we just rely too much on China. Maybe not for the full manufacture of some of it, and also just for the component parts. And they have shown themselves to be not an honest player, and they have these sort of cartels. I mean, this one author who's described this. Rosemary Gibson calls them Chinese cartels, and they'll dump ingredients on the market, and then we will stop manufacturing. For instance, penicillin, we did this in 2004, and they'll sell it for a few years, and then they own the market. We stop producing it, and then they can withhold or they can raise prices. They can do whatever they want with it. So it's a war, and we've got to prepare ourselves and gear up and start bringing some of our manufacturing of things that affect our health and our national security back. And there are certain members of the House and the Senate, Tom Cotton for one in the Senate, also Marsha Blackburn of Tennessee, and some in the House, like Mike Gallagher of Wisconsin, introducing legislation to start moving manufacturing of our prescription medicines back to the U.S. and something we absolutely have to do.
Let me mention again that Penna's commentary is posted on our website, so you can read it. But again, if you have not signed up to receive the Viewpoints commentary, it will come to your inbox free of charge. Mine come Monday through Friday. Hers will come to your inbox on Saturday. And let's, if we can, just real quickly, before I give you a preview of what we'll be talking about next week on Truth Team, mention we also have a link to Debbie Georgiadis, and simply go to AmericaCanWeTalk.org, right?
Absolutely. I do the show 4 days a week, Monday through Thursday, 3 p.m. Central Time. And it is just a commentary about America. We have great guests and we have many great guests talking about all the situations we are facing in America. And this month, because we in Dallas are under a shelter in place, I'm doing the show from my home studio, so it looks a little different, but same studio setup, and it's just wonderful. Love to have you tune in.
And you can watch it right there, going to America Can We Talk. Well, Penna, you'll be with me next Friday. I think Kelly will be as well, but let's mention a few other people we'll have on the program with us. We'll have Gary Bauer. Sean McDowell will be talking about some of the apologetics issues. Rick Santorum will be with us as well. We have Eric Metaxas talking about all these issues in the news. Had to get a little bit political, so Representative Louis Gohmert will be with us as well, and Oliver North. So is that a pretty good one?
Wow,
Those are all the names,
okay.
because I've got your friend Candy Noble and Kathy Ward and a few others in the other hours. So there are all sorts of great people that you'll hear next week. And again, I hope that you will call in and listen in if you can, because if nothing else, I want to get this flash drive to you that just has hours and hours of great material. And I recognize not everybody can support us, but if nothing else, I just think this would be a great week to once again look at what is happening in our country. And so if nothing else, Debbie, thank you for joining us. And Penna, thank you for joining me as well.
Great to be here.
It's been fun.
Looking forward to next week, which will be our Truth Team. If you'd like more information, go to the website, pointofview.net. You can also go to America Can We Talk. I want to thank Andrew and Steve. Have a great weekend. See you back here on Monday, right here on Point of View.
2020. Is there anything important happening this year? Well, not unless you consider major disputes in various Christian denominations, international tensions over a flu epidemic, economic uncertainties, and a presidential election important. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kirby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It's easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.